Live NFL trivia every Wednesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge for a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. There are many ways that players can lose their starting jobs. You can lose it because of an injury. You can lose it because you just flat out stink and are underperforming. You can lose it because someone else has overtaken you on the depth chart thanks to some great performances in practice and in the opportunities you got. You can lose it because you got suspended, or because you got a new head coach and the coach prefers someone else, or because of a factor completely out of your control like your age, meaning that you're not going to be a part of the team's future plans. You can probably think of a million other reasons that I didn't say that can lead to a guy losing his starting job. But there aren't too many reasons as crazy as this one. Because not only did the player in question lose his starting job, but his illustrious NFL career came to an end in rather anti-climatic fashion. And it all had to do with a car ride. I'm not talking about a car ride where the player got injured or got arrested or anything along those lines. I'm talking about a regular car ride being the reason that a player lost his starting spot forever. Well, in 1970, that's exactly what happened with Cleveland Browns wide receiver Homer Jones, who was trying to make a good impression with his new team after a lot of success with the New York Giants and got off on the wrong foot. This is the story behind the car ride that ended a player's NFL career and cost him his starting spot. Before I talk about the car ride in question, we need some context to understand just who Homer Jones is, how good he was, and why the Cleveland Browns acquired him in the first place. When the New York Giants drafted Homer Jones in the 20th round of the 1963 NFL Draft, I'm not sure they could have realistically expected anything, especially since of the 14 players drafted in the final round of the draft that year, 12 of them never even played pro football, and the other one that did, Packers running back Bobby Brezina, played in one game, and that was with the Houston Oilers. Yet the Giants struck gold with this pick, because little did they know when they chose the Texas Southern wide receiver that he was going to take the NFL by storm, and was going to establish himself as one of the best wide receivers in the history of the Giants franchise, and I do not say that lightly. By 1966, he worked his way into the starting lineup, and even though the Giants were god-awful that year, finishing with the worst record in football at 112-1, Homer Jones was a bright spot by recording 48 receptions for 1,044 yards and 8 touchdowns. He finished 6th in the league in receiving touchdowns, 4th in receiving yards, and 3rd in yards per reception. As a side note, if you want to learn more about the 1966 Giants and just how bad they were, click the card in the upper right corner. For an encore, Jones followed it up in 1967 with that incredible season where he started every game and recorded 49 receptions for 1,209 yards and 13 touchdowns, being named a Pro Bowler for the first time ever, and being named the second-team All-Pro by the Associated Press. You could make the legitimate argument that in the near century-long history of the Giants, this 1967 season was the best year by any receiver in franchise history. He finished 2nd in receiving yards, only behind Ben Hawkins of the Philadelphia Eagles, and he led the league with 13 receiving touchdowns. It was the first time since 1945 that a Giant led the league in receiving touchdowns, when Frank Leibel did it with 10, and to date, is the last time that any Giant led the league in this category. At the time, his 1,209 receiving yards was the most by any receiver in a single season in franchise history, and that record held all the way until 2002, when Amani Toomer finally broke it with 1,343. And his 13 receiving touchdowns not only was a franchise record at the time, but still is a franchise record, although Odell Beckham Jr. tied that mark in 2015. Seriously, there might not have been a better season by a receiver in Giants history than what Homer Jones did in 1967, especially since his efforts took the Giants from a 1-win team to a 500 team. And Jones followed that up in 1968 with another Pro Bowl season where he finished with 45 receptions for 1,057 yards and 7 touchdowns. For the first time ever, he finished inside the top 10 in all 3 of the major categories in the same season, finishing inside the top 10 in receptions, receiving touchdowns, and receiving yards. From 1966 to 68, he had 3,310 receiving yards and 28 touchdowns, and had at least 1,000 yards every season, being incredibly consistent. There was perhaps no receiver in football better than Homer Jones, as the sure-handed player could go deep and make any defense pay the price. For any player to make this much of an impact is incredible. For a 20th round pick to do it is one of the all-time greatest draft steals, and we don't talk about it a whole lot today. But as great as he was for New York in the 1960s, by the start of the 1970s, and by the start of the brand new decade, he was going to find himself on a brand new team. going from one former Century Division team to another. Because in 1970, he would find a new home about 460 miles west of New York City, settling down with the Cleveland Browns. Entering the 1970 NFL Draft, the Browns felt that they needed a quarterback. Now, why exactly they felt that way, seeing as they had Bill Nelson, who made the Pro Bowl in 1969, guided the Browns to a 10-3-1 record, and finished 4th in passing yards and 2nd in passing touchdowns, only one behind Los Angeles Rams MVP quarterback Roman Gabriel, might seem puzzling on the surface, until you realize that Nelson's knees were notoriously bad, and he was one hit away from having his career end forever. Head coach Brandon Collier was incredibly blunt in his assessment of Nelson's knees, saying, "We've been living dangerously with Bill Nelson's weakness, and we decided not to play Russian roulette another year." That's pretty self-explanatory. Anytime your head coach is saying that playing you a quarterback is like playing Russian roulette, that's always a good sign. As a side note, to learn more about Bill Nelson and his NFL career, click the card in the upper right corner. With that, knowing that they needed a quarterback to prepare for the inevitable, they traded up with the Miami Dolphins to acquire their first-round pick, which was the number 3 pick in the draft, and they used that pick to select Purdue quarterback Mike Phipps, making him the second quarterback off of the board behind Terry Bradshaw. You're probably wondering what the Browns had to give up to get that number 3 pick, and all it cost them at the end of the day was some random receiver named Paul Warfield. I'm sure this won't turn out to be the worst trade that the Browns franchise has ever made, and won't backfire in absolutely spectacular fashion. But because of this trade, the Browns now had a hole at receiver. They needed someone to pair up alongside first-team All-Pro wideout Gary Collins. And the Browns knew just who to call as a trade partner, as they called into New York to work out a deal for Homer Jones, who was just a few years removed from leading the league in receiving touchdowns. Jones wasn't too happy in New York anyways by this point. His production took a steep decline in 1969 under new head coach Alex Webster, when he only had 744 receiving yards, ending his 3-year streak of crossing the 1,000-yard mark at 1 receiving touchdown, which was a far cry from the 28 touchdowns he had over the previous 3 seasons combined. Jones was criticized by the coaching staff at times for being absent-minded in games and for being lazy with his routes, and he got his playing weight all the way up to 230 pounds. And Jones himself admitted that he was unhappy because of all of this, along with the losses, as the Giants went 6-8 that season, and had never been above 500 in his 6 seasons that he actually saw playing time. Jones said on the situation in New York, "I wasn't getting much self-satisfaction. We lost a lot of games by close margins, and that is discouraging. So this trade seemed like a perfect fit. Jones would get a fresh start in Cleveland. He would fill a need, and he would be guaranteed to be the starter alongside Collins, as there was no competition. Heck, the Browns were so confident in Jones that in 17 rounds, they only drafted 1 receiver in their entire 1970 draft class, with that being an 11th round pick on Maine wideout Gene Benner, who never played a down in the NFL. Nothing was going to be able to stop Homer Jones from being the starter in Cleveland heading into the 1970 season. That was nothing except for a car. In 1970, the National Football League and American Football League officially merged, as the 2 leagues were now playing under one umbrella. And as you can probably expect with a complicated merger like that, there were some labor issues that needed to be sorted out. I'm not going to dive too much into the specifics of it, but during the summer, tensions between the players and the owners were high, as during negotiations on a new collective bargaining agreement, the owners requested that the players not have their lawyers present. You can imagine how well the players took that news. On July 3rd, 1 month before preseason games were set to kick off, the NFLPA went on strike, and for a while, the season looked bleak. It was only on August 3rd that everything resumed, and the 2 sides signed a CBA that would take them through the end of the 1973 season. But things were looking so bleak that Homer Jones had no optimism, and was not in Cleveland for any of this. He was at his home in Pittsburgh, Texas, which was a city in northeast Texas about 2 hours outside of Dallas, with a population of around 3,700 people. And while he was home, he was fishing and hanging out at the local motorcycle shop. Jones figured he was going to be there a while, especially since the owners threatened to cancel the entire season because the talks were progressing that poorly. But when a deal was reached and everyone was ready to go back to work, what did Homer Jones do? Well, he did nothing. He was fishing, and had no clue as to what was happening. It was only the next day when he went to the motorcycle shop and was speaking to people that people were talking about how the strike was over, and the players were ready to go back to work. Obviously, This must have been a big shock to Jones, as all of a sudden, he was told that it was time to get back to work. Now, Jones could have taken the first flight out from Dallas to Cleveland. However, there were a few problems with that. Number one, who knows what the flight schedule was even like for the day, and if there were even direct routes from Dallas to Cleveland in the first place. I'm pretty good at researching things, but I'm not going to be able to find that out no matter how hard I try. But number two, even if hypothetically, he could have gotten out on the next flight and could have made it to Cleveland, flights were ridiculously expensive. The Airline Deregulation Act was passed in 1978, which, to make an incredibly complicated act simplified, helped make airline tickets way more affordable. Yes, it had a bunch of other effects, but for the purposes of our story, this is the big one. In 1970, the average price of an airline ticket was $550. Now, even by 2022 standards, paying $550 for a flight is a lot of money. When you take inflation into account, back in 1970, you were paying $3,200 for a ticket. Flying was a luxury, and you have to remember that NFL players were not exactly making a whole lot of money back in 1970. A lot of the players worked second jobs in the offseason, which is part of why training camp and the preseason were so long, because you truly needed that time to get into game shape. Earl Morrall, the MVP quarterback of the Baltimore Colts in 1968 that guided the team to an appearance at Super Bowl III, nearly retired after the season because his job that he had in the offseason was netting him a fairly substantial amount of money. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. In other words, even in a perfect world where all the flights line up and the flight from Dallas to Cleveland isn't booked, it's not like Homer Jones could just drop $550 on a plane ticket like that, which meant that the only way he was going to be able to make it to Cleveland was by driving. The obvious pro driving is that it's significantly cheaper. The obvious con of driving, however, it takes a really long time. To drive from Pittsburgh, Texas, to where the Browns were holding training camp, assuming you take no breaks, is 17 hours. It's over 1,000 miles. And just like Vanessa Carlton would walk 1,000 miles to see you tonight, Homer Jones would need to go 1,000 miles to make it back to camp, and to appear with the Browns for the first time. The ride went smoothly. Again, there's nothing tragic that happened here during this car ride, like a speeding ticket, or an arrest, or a crash, or a life-changing injury. However, it was still a lengthy car ride, and by the time Jones showed up to camp, he was 2.5 days late, with practice for the first preseason game about to wrap up in 2 days. And maybe this wouldn't have been a problem if it wasn't for the fact that he was a brand new player on the team, so he still needed to get into the rhythm and the flow of the offense and learn the playbook. If we have the exact same storyline, but it's Gary Collins who had to do this, odds are this becomes a non-issue. But because this was a player in his first season, he wasn't exactly guaranteed the starting job. And by the time Jones arrived in training camp, there was a player who was doing so well that he earned the starting spot, and Jones was unable to reclaim it from him. In 1969, the Browns drafted a wide receiver out of Arizona State named Fair Hooker. Yes, that was his real name. And along with being a fair hooker, he was a fair receiver. The coaching staff was impressed with him, with Collier saying, "If you think Homer Jones doesn't have a competition, you better think again. He's done exceptionally well. He hasn't learned all the things that a great receiver knows yet, but he's really working hard." And as team publicist Nate Wallach said on Hooker's performance in training camp after getting the starting spot, he was so outstanding that Jones never has got the job. Homer Jones, by all accounts, was supposed to be the starter in Cleveland. They probably don't trade away Paul Warfield if they're not confident that they can land Jones. And yet, he lost his starting spot because he got Wally Pipp off of a car ride. And there's a reason that you haven't seen any footage of Homer Jones in a Browns uniform, and that all the highlights are of his time with the Giants. And that's because, well, there's not a whole lot to show. Jones finished the 1970 season with 10 receptions for 141 yards and 1 receiving touchdown, which was a 43-yarder in the final week of the season against the Denver Broncos. I should note that he had the first ever kickoff return for a touchdown in Monday Night Football history, when he returned 194 yards against the New York Jets in Week 1. But outside of that, Jones did next to nothing. He averaged less than 1 catch per game for the first time in his career. His 14.1 yards per catch was a far cry from his glory days with the Giants, where he was consistently near the top of the league in that category as a deep threat, and that average was the lowest total of his career. And he never reclaimed that starting spot, with Fair Hooker getting the nod for most of the season. Jones never played another snap in the NFL after the 1970 season, with this incredibly disappointing and underwhelming campaign being his final memory in the league. From leading the league in touchdown catches to out of the league in the span of 3 years, with no injuries involved and before the age of 30. Truly a shockingly fast downfall. This is one of those situations where it's tough to blame the player involved. Yes, Jones could have avoided this by staying in Cleveland, but it's tough to blame him for not doing that, since there was a legitimate threat that the season was going to be canceled, and since it seemed like no progress was being made. News didn't exactly travel fast back then, and Jones had no way of knowing that the labor dispute was over. Once he found out, he immediately went to camp, driving the 17 hours non-stop, outside of what I'm assuming was the occasional bathroom break. He pretty much did everything right here once he found out the news. But he lost his starting job, in essence, because of his car. In the battle of man versus machine, back in 1970, when it came to Homer Jones, we know exactly who came out on top. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. To see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.